Nations. All three are responsible for Ethiopia in their respective services. Before I now give the floor to Thomas Tobé and Udo Bullmann for their introductory remarks, let me recall that the conflict in northern Ethiopia is soon going in its fourth year. The Tigray, Amhara, Afar, and Oromo provinces are massively affected, and access to help and the basics of livelihood is blocked for millions of people. In October last year, the United Nations issued a stark warning of the heightened risk of genocide and atrocity crimes in Ethiopia. 10 days ago, the state of emergency in the Amhara region, originally declared in August last year, was prolonged by the Ethiopian parliament for another 4 months, giving the government of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed the powers to restrict movement, ban public gatherings, and impose curfews. Ethiopia is involved in an unresolved water dispute with Sudan and Egypt, and creates, through its engagement to recognize Somaliland, further risk of turmoil in the neighborhood. We shouldn't forget that Addis Ababa hosts the African Union, and that a spread of insecurity to the capital region could severely undermine its functioning. The security situation in and around Ethiopia is serious. It is serious, and the deterioration is unfortunately not ruled out. All conditions are united for the EU to act to prevent further deterioration of the situation inside the country and in favor of promoting stability in the entire region. I now give the floor to Thomas Tobé.
Thank you, David, and I think it is very good that we could have this exchange together between AFET, DEVE, and DROIT. It is not the first time that we discuss the overall situation in Ethiopia together. As you know, this country is facing multiple challenges, and it is important to look at this in a holistic way. For many years, Ethiopia was one of the closest partners to us in the region, with the country perceived as the anchor of stability in the Horn of Africa. As we know, the situation changed with the eruption of the conflict in the Tigray region, which led to the EU at the end of 2020 to freeze budget support and suspend preparation of a multi-annual indicative program under the NDC instrument. The multi-annual indicative program with Ethiopia for 2024-2027 was launched in October 2023, after the parties to the conflict agreed on the cessation of hostilities in the Tigray region, and because the Ethiopian government made commitments on the peace process and transitional justice and reform. It is now, I would say, a source of great concern to see that the conflict in Amhara region, which erupted last year, has further intensified with reports of alleged violations of human rights. Despite reports from the federal government of improved security, the parliament decided last week to extend the state of emergency in the region without paving the way for a peaceful solution to the conflict. To make matters worse, several regions in Ethiopia are affected by a severe drought. Millions of lives and livestock are at risk, with reports of alarming food insecurity and rising malnutrition. It is estimated that the number of critically food insecure people will continue to grow over the next few months. Urgent humanitarian assistance is required, notably in Amhara, where the situation is further worsened by the conflict, and in Tigray, where communities have yet to recover from the last conflict. Our exchange today will allow us, hopefully, to understand better the scale of the humanitarian needs and the food security situation in the country. Udo?
Thanks, colleagues, Thomas and David. Let me first of all highlight that Ethiopia is a key partner for the European Union in the Horn of Africa, a region of tremendous strategic significance. After the change of power in 2018, many of us observed with hope a country that appeared to be on the way of a historic transition to democracy after years of authoritarian rule and turmoil. Unfortunately, as colleagues highlighted already, the Tigray war brought that transition to a sudden halt. Today, and despite the signing 14 months ago of the Pretoria Agreement that meant an end to the hostilities, Ethiopia is still struggling to regain peace and stability. The new conflict in Amhara is currently the most alarming. However, it is far from being the only place in the country where civilians are targeted and killed in significant numbers, particularly because of their ethnicity. In recent months, the National Human Rights Institution has also reported large-scale extrajudicial killings, mass arbitrary arrests and detentions, sexual and gender-based violence, and the use of child soldiers. On a positive note, the federal government is committed to fostering reconciliation and preventing internal conflicts through a process of national dialogue and to scaling up accountability for human rights violations by establishing a transitional justice policy. Today's meeting gives us the opportunity to take stock with our guests of the efforts made by the Ethiopian authorities in this direction. Last December, a delegation from my subcommittee led by Ms. Isabel Wiesner-Lima visited the capital Addis Ababa and Mekele in Tigray. I would like to warmly thank our 4 members of the delegation for their work, and I look forward to hearing their views and those of our guest speakers on the human rights situation and the prospects of our country in Ethiopia.
Thank you, Udo. Without further delay, I will now give the floor to our 2 guest speakers. We will start with Dr. Sarah Vaughan. Her intervention will set the scene of the political situation and the challenges faced by Ethiopia. So, Ms. Vaughan, you are connected, I think, digitally or remote, as we say. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. My name is Sarah Vaughan, and I am an independent researcher, and these remarks reflect my own views. They're not made on behalf of any other institution. I've been asked to give you a brief overview. I will make 6 points, starting at the macro level and concluding with the more specific. Firstly, geopolitics. I see weakness and dependency. In my view, Ethiopia's sovereign decision-making power is weaker than at any time since the Derg regime, when the military government was strongly dependent on the patronage of the Soviet Union. The Horn region is more violent and more volatile than at any time since the 1980s, and the influence of foreign powers, particularly but not only the Gulf states, is stronger. This has exacerbated violence of civil wars in both Ethiopia and Sudan, and the toll on civilians. The Ethiopian Prime Minister's striking new saber-rattling in relation to the country's need for access to the sea, inverted commas, last year directed towards Eritrea and this year arising from Ethiopia's controversial MOU with Somaliland, has contributed to destabilizing the region. In the last 6 months, Ethiopia has increasingly antagonized its neighbors with little evidence of gain of its national interest. Secondly, the economic picture, which is also one of dependency, here just about averting collapse. Ethiopia's revenues from taxes and exports continue to decline, with the latter artificially boosted by the export of minerals. Mining is increasingly important, and it comes with high levels of conflict risk. Proposed economic reforms, including devaluation, will, in my view, do little to address the deep dysfunctionality of the Ethiopian economy under current policy, but it will exacerbate the erosion of service delivery. The scope for leverage on the part of the IFIs or European partners should be carefully considered in a context of high levels of largesse, particularly from the Gulf states, but also including Chinese debt rescheduling. Thirdly, the domestic political level. Ongoing concentration and personalization of power in the person of the Prime Minister, who again shuffled his cabinet this week. This is an increasingly regular pattern, and on this occasion demonstrated just how far the pool of political loyalists on which he's able to draw has shrunk, particularly amongst Tigrayan and Amhara politicians. Over the last 6 months, prominent Oromos and Amharas have withdrawn from the ruling Prosperity Party, and along with key opposition figures, many are now based outside the country or jailed. Fourthly, the erosion of state delivery capacity. One of the most important and least talked about effects of the last decade of underfunding and political centralization has been the disintegration of local state delivery capacity in health, education, agriculture, or relief. One of Africa's most effective developmental states is now subject to widespread inertia, corruption, or collapse at the micro level. Many of the data sets key to performance evaluation have been discontinued or eroded. Fifthly, I agree with the pessimism already expressed in the introductory remarks. Unresolved domestic conflict continues in at least 3 important regions to drain the resources of the country and boost human rights abuses. In Amhara, a popularly supported but fragmented insurgency has seen the army deployed since August last year in an increasingly bloody campaign. As has been noted, a 6-month state of emergency was recently renewed, and on the 29th of January, between 50 and 80 individuals are believed to have been killed at a town near the regional capital. Unconfirmed reports indicate execution-style killings by the army going door to door. This is not a war which can be won militarily, and it is unlikely that it will be resolved by negotiation in the near future. Secondly, in Oromia, the 5-year insurgency of the Oromo Liberation Army in the west came close to a negotiated settlement in November last year, after weeks of work between the OLA and the military, before failing at the last minute. Fighting continues. In both of these regions, the government has closed the internet, and journalists have been precluded from travel and arrested. In Tigray, although the cessation of hostilities agreement has held since November 2022 with no fighting between the signatories, key tenets have not been implemented, notably the return of nearly 1 million IDPs to Western Tigray. Frustrations between Tigrayan and federal authorities are escalating, with many Tigrayans seeing an ongoing federal prosecution of war by other means over the last year. Finally, the return of starvation and famine. The failure of the 2023 harvest is precipitating widespread starvation in eastern Tigray, northern Amhara, and Afar, at a time when international funding for humanitarian activities is low. In Tigray, last year's harvest saw only 37% of the production of a normal year. This comes on top of 3 years during which the war eroded the resources of the rural majority, caused by looting and destruction, by the withholding of salaries, by the closure of alternative livelihoods options, trade, migration, credit, small enterprises, and by the halting of safety net transfers, which supported 1 million Tigrayans before the war and which have not since resumed at this scale. The suspension of aid between March and November last year because of a national scandal of misappropriation was the final straw for many peasant farmers. In my estimation, many thousands have already died. The resumption of aid is welcome, but it will need to be massively scaled up if many tens of thousands more are to avoid the same fate. Allow me to conclude, Mr. Chairman, by commenting that since my first visit to rural Tigray in 1988, exactly 35 years ago at the end of the Derg period, I have never seen the rural economy in northern Ethiopia in such a desperate state as I did in November and December last year. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Dr. Vaughan, for this introduction and also being so precise. We will now move to our second intervention that will focus on the drought, the food security situation and the humanitarian needs. So, Mr. Fredrik Lee Olsson, Director of the WFP Brussels office, please.
Honourable Chairpersons, distinguished members of the Development, Foreign Affairs and Human Rights Committees of the European Parliament, I'm honoured for the invitation to address this esteemed assembly today on behalf of the World Food Programme, the world's largest humanitarian agency. For millions of people worldwide, WFP's emergency relief during crisis is the difference between life and death. While numbers are not yet available for 2023, in 2022 we assisted some 160 million people worldwide. On any given day, WFP has 6,500 trucks, 20 ships and 140 aircraft on the move. We can do this with the support of generous donors, as we're entirely funded through voluntary contributions. And in this regard, we are grateful that the European Union, through the Commission and its member states, are a top donor to WFP. And it is needed, as we have entered 2024, a staggering 309 million people around the world are facing acute levels of food insecurity in the 71 countries with WFP operations and where data is available. Honourable Chairs, today I bring to your attention the gravity of the situation in Ethiopia, where a perfect storm of interconnected crises threatens the lives and livelihoods of millions, placing Ethiopia on the verge of a humanitarian catastrophe. We confront an urgent and escalating humanitarian situation in Ethiopia. Humanitarian assistance remains an essential lifeline for 20 million Ethiopians, and we estimate that 15.8 million people are currently food insecure and will require food assistance throughout this year. At the heart of the crisis lies the convergence of multiple shocks, each compounding the other with devastating consequences. The people of Ethiopia are grappling with overlapping shocks of armed conflict, climate shocks, disease outbreaks, and the spectre of rising inflation. Many parts of the country have been or continue to be ravaged by hostilities, resulting in prolonged displacements of currently 4.5 million people and enormous humanitarian needs. The impact of these challenges is particularly acute in the northern regions of Afar, Amhara, and Tigray. Despite our concerted efforts, the situation continues to deteriorate, with emergency levels of food insecurity expected to spread across these regions, including Tigray. Additionally, over 1 million people in Ethiopia's southern regions are still grappling with the lingering effects of the most recent drought, which was the worst in 40 years, caused by 6 consecutive failed rainy seasons. Ethiopia has, over the past several years, been affected by recurring droughts, increasing in both duration and frequency due to the climate crisis. Due to both domestic and global economic shocks, the inflation rate in Ethiopia is among the highest recorded globally, at over 30%. As a result, prices of essential commodities have soared, while the purchasing power of Ethiopians continues to be eroded. Allegations of widespread food aid diversion and its impact on food aid distribution have also deepened pre-existing vulnerabilities and contributed to food insecurity. Honourable Chairs, as members of the European Parliament, your attention to the humanitarian situation in Ethiopia underscores the importance of action. Let me therefore outline 3 strands of action that we, as a humanitarian agency, consider are needed to prevent further deterioration. Firstly, there is an urgent need for immediate and sustained humanitarian assistance. Our teams are working tirelessly to deliver life-saving food assistance to those in need. However, our efforts are hampered by severe funding shortfalls. Unless aid is provided at scale in the first quarter of this year, millions of Ethiopians will be at risk of a major humanitarian catastrophe. Secondly, I want to make a plea together with our sister agency, UNHCR, on behalf of the refugees in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is the third largest refugee hosting country in Africa, with almost 1 million refugees, mainly from South Sudan, Somalia, Eritrea, and Sudan. These individuals have fled conflict and persecution in their home countries, seeking safety and refuge in Ethiopia. However, funding shortages have forced us to make ration cuts for close to 90% of the refugees already, and they are now receiving rations equivalent to only 60% of their daily needs, leaving them both vulnerable and hungry. If we do not have funding, WFP will be compelled to cease food distributions to refugees from April, further exacerbating their suffering and despair. Finally, I wish to emphasize the importance of resilience-building programs in Ethiopia. While immediate relief is essential, the international community must also invest in long-term solutions to break the cycle of food insecurity. That is why in WFP we are implementing programs to tackle the root causes of hunger by strengthening communities' resilience to future shocks and reduce the humanitarian needs of tomorrow. By empowering local communities to build sustainable livelihoods and food systems, we pave the way for a more resilient and food-secure future for all Ethiopians. Honourable Chairs, in conclusion, I urge the esteemed members of the European Parliament to lend support to our efforts to address the humanitarian situation in Ethiopia. The time to act is now. Through solidarity with the people of Ethiopia and partnership with WFP, it is possible to avert a major humanitarian crisis and provide hope to millions of Ethiopians in their time of need. Let us stand together as champions of compassion and humanity, offering a lifeline to those who need it the most. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lee Olsson from the World Food Programme. I will now hand over the chairing to DROIT Chair, Mr. Bullman.
Thanks to our guests. I will now ask our newly elected chair of the Africa-EU Joint Parliamentary Assembly. Congrats again, Max Orwild.
Merci, Messieurs les Présidents.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to the experts. Colleagues, the humanitarian crisis facing the Ethiopian people is catastrophic. 2 years of war, extreme drought in the Horn of Africa, 20,000 people in need of humanitarian aid. It's an intolerable situation. The promise of peace from the Prime Minister has not been adhered to. The government is putting greater pressure on the population, despite the embargo and the blocks in the press. I reiterate the request of the European Parliament in its resolution of November 2020 to give immediate and free access to all humanitarian associations. This is absolutely necessary. The peace agreement has not solved all the problems. I'm delighted about the first progress for access to education with a view to peace in the future. But we need to be very cautious, and here I insist on the situation in situ. The aid, European aid, needs to reach the people who need it. We regret the side-stepping of the rules on humanitarian aid. We need freer, more transparent humanitarian aid channels. So my call to the government would be give yourselves the means to receive the aid for the people who need it most. we call for close cooperation between the EU and Ethiopia, the strategic partnership, historic bilateral agreement from 2016, and the multi-annual programme 24-27 shows how committed Europe is to Ethiopia. Let's continue to work together to strengthen the links between the EU and Africa. Thank you.